Jackie Doyle-Price.
Madam Deputy Speaker, and can I thank the Honourable Lady for the speech she's just given, and also to thank her for doing what she's just done each year, because she, by taking this step, has drawn a huge amount of attention to this issue. And we are all talking about it a lot more as a consequence. And personally, I'm grateful, and women up and down this country should be also. I'm also very pleased to see my honourable friend, the member for Charnwood, witnessing that speech and in his place. And I hope he will take this in the spirit with which it's given. When I say I hope he was listening, because we still have a culture in this country in which our criminal justice system devalues women when it comes to being victims of crime. And it's all very well, you know, we pass these wonderful laws, don't we, in this place, about, you know, equality. We've got the Equality Act, isn't it marvellous? Behaviourally, there is still massive prejudice and discrimination against women, and nowhere is that more clear when it comes to the murder of women. You know, if a man murders his wife, he's treated less severely by the courts. That surely is wrong, and that's something we must absolutely tackle. And, you know, I mean, it's so depressing that, you know, over the recent months we have seen high-profile cases of this nature which have hit the headlines. But it's done in a very voyeuristic way. We still end up then talking about these women who have been victims of terrible violence as if it's some kind of soap opera, and that just isn't good enough. We just need to have absolute tolerance of that. Yeah.
I thank the honourable member for giving way in her powerful speech on this subject. Does she agree with me that the role of the media in reporting these crimes, going back to the tragic murder where essentially a number of these men are depicted as family men and something just went wrong, they should be viewed how they are, murderers?
I think the Honourable Lady makes a point very powerfully. The way the media reports these things are like soap opera, not like crime. And it's about creating a story around someone where actually there is someone who's been a victim of a hideous act of violence here. And she's quite right to describe people, to highlight the fact that, oh, it's a family man's done this, and, oh, well, they were feeling so diminished because they'd lost their job. That happens on the one hand. At the same time, we have female sex workers murdered every week of the year who don't even merit a mention. And that just illustrates the pervasiveness of the culture in this country, which still treats women as objects. And it is still very much a world which runs according to men. And I'm standing here listening to myself thinking, God, what happened to you, Jackie? You know, when I was growing up in the 1980s, you know, I thought the battles of feminism were won. I never thought I'd be standing here and banging on about the rights of women. But actually, as time progresses, I just think we're going backwards. It's almost as if Parliament's passed these laws to establish equality, and that means, well, that's all right, I've done, job done. But actually, it's not done that at all. In many respects, it has gone backwards. So, you know, yeah, I don't want to be treated like a delicate little flower. But just because we now have a law that doesn't do that and establishes my rights, that's actually given a lot of men a behavioural excuse not to treat me with respect and not to recognise the fact that I do have vulnerabilities being a woman, and you know, I do have vulnerabilities. I'm quite happy to accept that. I know some of my male colleagues think that I don't, but I do. And yes, indeed.
My honourable friend for giving way, and does she agree with me that, I mean, one of the things the government's done in the last 10 years by making relationship and sex education mandatory for all school-aged children will help to start really embed in the education of all of our children in this country what a good relationship looks like. And that's going to be very pertinent when it comes to the treatment of women in the future.
I do agree with my right honourable friend, but I do have a word of caution in that, because it has to be the right materials. And I'm afraid we have a bit of a Wild West out there, because we've had all kinds of organisations bidding for government money to produce materials for this space. But I think some of the materials I've seen, certainly I would not feel appropriate to be shared with school-aged children.
Would you join me in also urging Ofsted to do a deep dive on this issue so that they can look at exactly the point that she's made. It's an issue that I've raised with government ministers and also with Ofsted Direct.
I think actually that point is a very good one, because I think in order to guarantee the quality of the schools and the content, there does need to be a degree of inspection, because we know we will find bad actors everywhere in society, and perhaps in schools we need to make sure we do that protection. Yes.
Just very briefly, I know there's lots of pressure on this time, but isn't it also important that the people who deliver these courses, the teachers in the room, have to be specialist teachers rather than leaving it to a math teacher?
I have less sympathy with that point, actually. I think we should all understand what standards of good behaviour are, and it should be intrinsic. Frankly, no teacher should be allowed in a classroom who doesn't understand respect. It comes down to that, ultimately, and I think they should all be equipped with that. If I could make some progress, because at the moment my speech has been entirely interventions, so if you wouldn't mind. I'm glad to see the Honourable Lady, the member for Kingston upon Hull, in her space, because I wanted to talk today about abortion. And, I think it's very important that, as we in this place here, the Mother of Parliaments, this advanced democracy, that we really challenge ourselves about whether the laws we have here are really fit for purpose, particularly when on things like abortion, we are quite good at lecturing the rest of the world about these things. And my fundamental view is that our abortion law is currently not safe. And the most important thing that we can do in this place is make sure that our laws do no harm. And I've said this before in this House. The law we have regulating abortion is older than me, and frankly, it's I haven't worn too well, but that's worn even worse. It is in desperate need of reform, and I'm afraid that while ever we treat this as an issue of conscience, we are failing women, because that law predates medical abortion. It deals with a situation when the only terminations you could have were surgical, which as we all know, are more dangerous. And the law is drawn upon that basis, which is why it relies on 2 doctors having to certify that this procedure is necessary. 2 doctors now, really? When we have the availability of medical abortion? I just don't think it's necessary. Back in the 1990s, when Kenneth Clarke was Secretary of State for Health, so we're going back a long way, the abortion law was amended at that point to enable abortions to take place in different settings other than the licensed establishments that the state approves of. But it took until the pandemic for that to actually be made a reality. And actually the reality it was made wasn't the one intended at the time the law was passed in the 90s. The whole idea was that it recognised that we now had medical abortion, which could be administered safely by plail. And the idea was, when Ken Clarke accepted that amendment, was that we would be able to access abortions in places like family planning clinics and places in the community, instead of the stigmatised listed places that have to be regulated by the Secretary of State, which, by the way, has made sure that our abortions are a monopoly service played by 2 providers in the independent sector. They're very rarely done by the NHS. And actually, we've discussed earlier this week the public order bill and the whole issues of protest. I mean, would there really be so much protest if abortion services were more embedded in our established National Health Service, instead of shunted away into back streets somewhere, which make them a target? Yes, indeed.
I'm grateful. It's worth remembering that an early Conservative woman Member of Parliament, Margaret Thatcher, in 1967, both voted to decriminalise male homosexual acts, and she stayed up all night to help get David Steele's abortion bill through the House of Commons. Can I put it to my honourable friend that, given that there are now over 200,000 abortions a year in this country, it takes 2 to tango, that's 400,000 people contributing, some perhaps more than once, but not many, it is so common that we ought to make it easier when people decide that having an abortion is appropriate. They can do it easily and safely without embarrassment.
That's exactly the point that I was coming to make, that my honourable friend has done. The fact of the matter is I absolutely respect why members of this House have ideological objections to abortion and why they will always vote to restrict it. But the fact is, abortion is an established right now in this country, and it is our obligation to make sure that those laws are safe, that women can access abortion as early as possible in their pregnancy. That is actually the most important thing. That is the safest thing, and that's why they do need to be much more readily available. So if I could make a point to the front bench, which I fear will fall on deaf ears because we continue to see this as an issue of conscience rather than one of safety, that this is something which really ought to be reviewed. And might I suggest to the Minister, we now have a Women's Health Ambassador in Leslie Regan. And Leslie, as a former head of the Royal College of Obstetricians and Gynaecologists, is eminently qualified to undertake a review about, perhaps not to make recommendations, but just to perhaps highlight how the current abortion law isn't fit for purpose, so that we can properly review how we might make it better. And I'd also just say that the way that the established Abortion Act is not encouraging a healthy debate about this either, on both sides, I might add, because that is the starting frame of reference. So we end up in this ridiculous debate about time limits, and ultimately we just need to get away from this and think about it as a health procedure, and not in the way that, ultimately, when that Act was passed back in 1968, it was a radical measure, it was an empowering measure, it was one that advanced women's rights. But here we are more than 50 years later, and we need to take a good look at it. And I will give way to the Honourable Lady because I know she has very passionate and informed views and has done so much on this issue.
I'm very grateful to the Honourable Lady, and I'm so pleased to hear her make this speech. I think what's even more worrying is that the 67 Act is over 50 years old, but of course it's underpinned by the Offences Against the Persons Act 1861, which is a Victorian piece of legislation which says that abortion is a criminal offence. And really, until we decriminalise abortion and treat it as a healthcare matter, we really are not going to get rid of the stigma. That seems to me the thing that we need to do in this country, to decriminalise, treat it as a healthcare matter, which I think the Honourable Lady is supportive of.
Yes, absolutely. It must be treated as a healthcare matter. The point she raises there about the 1861 Act, I mean, the truth is, I looked into this when I was a minister to see how many convictions there were. And to be honest, we still need to have some kind of protection which maintains the criminality of abortion, where there could be coercion involved. And, again, these are issues which are, again, still crimes against the woman.
Grateful, and I will be very short, but decriminalisation does not mean deregulation. And of course, all the healthcare laws that apply to our clinicians and nurses and everybody else would still need to apply. So things like coercion absolutely would be regulated for and would be treated as an offence. But the underlying issue of women being criminalised in that Offences Against the Persons Act has to go.
Yeah.
I think the fact that the Honourable Lady and I are having a ding-dong about this while we have to have the same outcome illustrates just how badly this current debate is taking place because of the bookends of the 1861 Act and the 1968 Act. And, again, it comes back to we are all wanting better outcomes and a safe system for women, and that should be our starting point, not those two pieces of legislation. And actually, we can probably strengthen the protections for women with regard to coercion if we do look at it in that way. So, as usual, Madam Deputy Speaker, I like to use this speech to give challenge to ourselves about what we aren't getting right for women, but, I haven't got till midnight on Sunday, so I'm going to have to be a bit more limited in what I'm able to tackle, but I'm pleased to be able to say what I've said about abortion today. I also want to come back to the Honourable Lady's speech when she talked about indecent exposure. And I absolutely must amplify her overall argument where, to be honest, flashing is not seen as a crime. It has been totally normalised. And I heard on the radio just this week that as many as 50% of women have been victim to this crime. And I can't emphasise enough that sexual violence is something that escalates. So the moment some things are tolerated, then that behaviour is going to only increase. And Wayne Couzens is perhaps the best example of that. And this is where I come back to, passing laws that give equality, have advances for women that are meant to empower us. And I really want to talk about the whole issue of contraception, because yes, it's given women the opportunity to take control of their fertility and enjoy their sexuality and all the rest of it. But it's also generated a culture where men feel even more entitled and where girls are feeling more and more forced to actually become more sexualised beings earlier than perhaps they are ready. And this is why I feel very, very strongly that we need to keep our safe spaces.
Yeah. I'd like to just point out to my honourable friend, whom I really, really value what she's saying. She's great, saying some great things. I don't think that it is contraception which has led to many of the challenges that young women are facing today, especially more violent, dangerous sex. The contraceptive pill has been around for 70 years. But the violence that women are facing today is also linked to the pornography and other issues.
I'm sorry, but my honourable friend is clearly not understanding what I am saying at all. At all, yeah. Well, she's had no sleep. The point being that we have a culture where girls are expected to be sexualised at an earlier and earlier age. And more of this behaviour is being tolerated. You know, we have a situation, we have a growth of gangs, and we talk about boys stabbing each other. We don't talk about the sexualised sharing behaviour that happens amongst those gangs. But coming back to my real point, this is why we really need to be very jealous about guarding our safe spaces. And, you know, we've had this debate a number of times before, and again, it comes back, it's similar to the abortion debate. We end up having a debate about, on a very polarised basis about things where actually we're talking about safety. I was very concerned to read in Parliament's gender guidance that the advice given here to anyone who wants to, in regards to gender, is that people should be encouraged to use the facilities that they feel comfortable with. I then went on to read that as part of the restoration and renewal project, 70% of our toilets are going to be gender neutral, and the remaining 30% will be split evenly between males and females. So we will only have 15% of toilets under restoration and renewal that are female only. And, you know, at the risk of upsetting some of my male colleagues here, actually, you know, I think some of them actually aren't very comfortable with shared gender spaces either, mainly because they don't find men's toilets very nice, and they're even more embarrassed to have to share them with women, if truth be known. It is important that women have their own spaces so that we can maintain our privacy and dignity. And again, it comes back to the point about indecent exposure. Because those of us who jealously guard the need for women to have their own toilets and their own changing facilities aren't scared of trans people, we are scared of male sexual predators. And the truth of the matter is that a male sexual predator will use every tool at his disposal to get access to his victims. And the fact is, you know, ultimately, you know, it's a behaviour none of us understand, but there are some men who think, you know, they're actually very proud of showing off their penis. God knows why, because, you know, they're not the best things to look at the best of times. But they love their penis so much, they want everyone else to see it. Well, we don't. And for that reason, I will not be apologetic in continuing to maintain my defence of making sure that we have our own facilities that men, for whatever reason, will not have access to, because we have now got to work hard to establish that proper respect. You know, while ever 50% of women are being victims of indecent exposure, we have not reached the level of respect that every woman in this country deserves to have from their male counterparts. And it is incumbent on all of us, I know we're mainly women here today in this chamber, but I also ask my male colleagues who are also here, thank you for being here, and please do your bit to make sure that we all enjoy that freedom as well. Thank you.
Hannah Bardell.
Thank you very much.